this afternoon, I guess. It's 4:30. This is the last Managing the Planet of the academic year for the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. And this is kind of a monthly thing we do during the academic year. And today's talk, a discussion talk, a little bit of everything, is the title is People, Place, and Planet, the Local Face of Climate Vulnerability. So I'm Dr. Dale Lockwood, professor in biology, and I'm moderating tonight's panel discussion, but I'm going to do less talking, and they're going to do most of the talking here briefly after I introduce everyone tonight. So our panelists tonight, Ken Shockley, professor in philosophy here at Colorado State University, David Schlossberg, who is a director of Sydney Environmental Institute and professor of environmental politics at the University of Sydney, so long ways away. Patricia Romero-Lankao, who is Canadian Excellence in Research Chair, professor at the University of Toronto. And then we have Sarah Walker, the order is different than on my sheet, assistant professor in human dimensions of natural resources here at Colorado State University. So we have quite a spread of people with different perspectives on this question, different locations themselves based on what we're talking about. Karen Bailey will be joining us a little bit later. She's a professor at the University of Colorado in Boulder and is driving here. We had an ETA of a few minutes from now. So we'll have her join in just a little bit. So first off, what I'd like to do is, talk about introduce the audience here, introduce the panelists as I've done. They're going to now give brief kind of 5-minute talks about their perspective on the general topic. So we're going to kind of go through that in order, and they'll each talk about that. And then after that, a couple of questions that are general questions we'll ask, and then we'll open it up towards the end for audience questions. So I will go around and let you, if you raise your hand, I'll let you ask your questions. So let's go ahead and get started tonight. And I'll just start from left to right. So if Karen arrives, we'll get her in the right slot. So Ken, would you lead us off on a kind of a discussion of your take on the topic today?
Sure. So I'm a philosopher, and philosophers get really worked up over ambiguities in concepts and the way in which the terms get tangled up. And it might seem like a real just worrying about nothing, but I think in this case, the ambiguities in the term vulnerability can have some real-world consequences and be deeply problematic. And so what I'm interested in mostly, and how my work relates to this topic, is I'm interested in the way in which different conceptions, different ways in which different meanings for the term vulnerability turn out to have substantially different significance in the development world and adaptation processes more generally. So I've written, I guess now for a few years, on the contrast between what I call individual vulnerability and systemic vulnerability, which might sound, again, just like whether it's an individual person or a critter or a system, and that's not a big deal. But I think it matters a lot. If you talk to your IT person and ask them whether or not the system should be vulnerable or not, they'll look at you like you're insane and like say, of course, like all vulnerability is a bad thing. There is no possibility for our IT system to be vulnerable that's in a good state. But if you ask that to an individual person, insofar as you like, say, friends, it's probably a good thing to have some level of vulnerability. And so there's these breaks between individual and systemic vulnerability, and these breaks between vulnerabilities that seem to be what I call normally balanced bad, so just generally bad, and those that are more neutral. And so these breakdowns in these concepts turn out to have real ramifications. So I spent some time there was an occasion where I was in Ghana and helping, this is just being charitable, I wasn't helping, he was showing me something. I didn't help him at all, he didn't need me, I was mostly in the way. There's this fisher person who was pulling in these nets in this village just downflow from Accra. And it was in this estuary that was just saturated with plastic, just saturated. Like if you went out to the sand, this beach is like 3-4 miles. And if you put your hand down, it's like 4 or 5 inches and it's just plastic saturated in the sand. the effect of that wasn't just the aesthetic one. The effect was that the estuary in which he and his family had been fishing for God knows how long, there weren't many fish left. And when you pulled the net in, you pulled in more plastic than fish. And so it turned out that the estuary had certain vulnerabilities, but so did he. And those vulnerabilities were interrelated in complicated ways. If you do something to mitigate the vulnerability of that estuary, you were likely to compromise the vulnerabilities that he felt. So those two vulnerabilities competed with each other in ways that made one worse than the other. And so I was struck in that case how in the developing world, just saying we need to mitigate vulnerabilities would miss some of the complexities between the interwoven nature of these vulnerabilities. So I spent a fair bit of time thinking about that, and then thinking about the way in which they're interrelated. The systemic vulnerabilities upon which that fisher depended when they were engaged in these activities turned out to be what in our parlance is thought to be the background conditions that enable his capabilities, the ways in which he might live a flourishing life. And so I've been interested in the way in which our intersecting vulnerabilities are shaped by different conceptions of place and time. And I'm not keeping track of time, and I have a tendency to go on forever, so.
You're good.
Oh, awesome, because I ended up, I'll do that until I'm no longer good.
Yeah. I'll throw something at you.
That works fine. So I was, I attended a meeting of the porcupine caribou herd in Inuvik, Canada, back in February. And at that point, the particular herd, the porcupine caribou herd, was the only caribou herd in the Arctic that we're aware of that hadn't undergone catastrophic collapse. It was declining, but not collapsing. By catastrophic, most of the caribou herds are declining to something like 10% of their populations 25 years ago. So species ending level collapse that we're talking about. And this one, it wasn't. It was having struggles, but we were interested in the management practices that enabled this caribou herd to maintain, or whether there's something else going on. That's what motivated the research question. But what was really striking was the way in which the discourse about vulnerability of the herd and of the individual caribou were interrelated in a complicated way, and I say it out loud, a fairly predictable way with the vulnerabilities of local populations. So the individual vulnerabilities and of both caribou and herd were tied up with the way in which climate change was compromising and putting stressors on the landscape. But the way in which the language of vulnerability got characterized and in that arena separated from adaptation. So the local populations and the cultures and the First Nations that were associated with harvesting the caribou were busy trying to adapt to vulnerabilities that they couldn't quite characterize or understand. Half of the management plan wasn't long-term management. It was figuring out how you adapted to a world where these vulnerabilities led to a slow decline and collapse of their background conditions. So I think that there are really interesting ways to explore, interesting from an academic point of view, but sort of heart-wrenching and catastrophic from a real-world point of view, about these intersecting vulnerabilities shape the opportunities for adaptation in these different sorts of contexts, across different ecological, social conditions. So anyway, that's what I work on, and I don't have a good punchline to end on, but that's what I'm doing. So,
Great, thanks. David, I'll let you speak.
First, hi, thanks for having me here. It's been a while since I've been to this town. It's been a while since I've lived in the US, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about some work in Sydney, about some other work I do. So I'm not a philosopher. I'm a part-time political theorist, and I've written on vulnerability and capabilities, but I'm also a sort of empirical environmental social scientist, and a lot of the work I've been doing since I've been in Sydney has been with the city of Sydney, with Resilient Sydney, which was one of the Rockefeller 100 resilient cities, with the region, on heat, with the state government, on questions of adaptation and resilience. And there, the main issue for me is, how some governments who have, who control the policy levers think about vulnerability. Okay, so for me, there are two different ways to think about vulnerability. In one way, we're all vulnerable in some way, right? We all have vulnerabilities. We all need things. We all, can be exposed to heat. We need water. We need food. We have vulnerability in some way. that's one way of understanding vulnerability. But the other way of understanding vulnerability is vulnerability that is constructed by bad public policy. So in Sydney, and people who live in Western Sydney in really crappy housing with Western-facing glass, who don't have income enough to buy air conditioning or to run air conditioning when they have it, this is the construction of vulnerability in Western Sydney. In a number of other areas in the state of New South Wales, vulnerability is constructed by governments pandering to developers who develop new housing in obvious floodplains, places where Aboriginal Australians said, don't build there, that's not a good idea, and of course those places get flooded out. That's the construction of vulnerability by bad public policy. So I've been a consultant to the city and to others doing this, and every time I see this phrase, vulnerable communities, that guts me as a theorist and as someone concerned about climate justice. There's no such thing as vulnerable communities. They are communities that are made vulnerable, and they're made vulnerable by bad policy. So that's my interest. So I made this suggested to the city that maybe they don't use this phrase and instead talk about the construction of vulnerability. And I heard last week, I read this line, vulnerabilized, right? So making vulnerable. So I think it is an action, and it's an action by governments to undermine the resilience of folks. That's not natural, right? That isn't, these are vulnerable communities. So that's a key thing. Tell me when to shut up, because I'll.
Got a minute.
So for me, this kind of policy that undermines people's ability to function, and it's individuals and it's communities, and this is something we should talk about, because it's not just people, individuals, and communities and ecological systems. There is the sense of entire communities being undermined. Again, in Western Sydney, it's migrant communities. There's no attention politically to the housing stock out there, or to energy justice, energy poverty out there as well. So for me, any policy that undermines individual and community function is an injustice. So there's housing policy, there's planning policy, there's transport policy, right? Bus stops that are 50 degrees Celsius. It's insane, right? 120 degrees or so, people waiting for buses and that kind of heat in Western Sydney. Transport, energy policies, all of these create and exacerbate vulnerability. And that's been my main focus in Sydney.
Great. Patricia, would you like to?
Oh, yeah. I take the two. Well, I'm glad that, I'm Patricia, and I'm glad that David and Ken already got us started. I also have been obsessed with defining vulnerability, but I also want to understand how we can create capacities. Something that has defined my work is to understand why is it that communities, although they mobilize or although they are super creative and have lots of assets, are not able to realize that potential. And I work a lot in cities, cities from Latin America, as you can hear from my accent, but also in the US. And I want to use the case of Los Angeles, the last city I worked with before moving to Toronto. The idea was to understand how to how the utility in LA could transition to 100% renewable energy in equitable ways. And that was a result of mobilization by communities and leaders, not by the utility, by the way. I was invited to lead the social science part, but the point I want to make is that I would agree with David that vulnerability and risk are socially constructed, so as climate change is socially created. Of course, it comes back to bite us in our backs, but we create it. And they are the result of process of development, of the way we interact with each other, and of the fact that some sectors, some people are more powerful, have the means to impose their decisions on others. And I want to use the example of LA to attest to that. There are many studies showing that you could easily map the areas of LA that were redlined at the dawn of the last century, those are the same areas that today are more likely whose populations today are more likely to be neglected with lack of infrastructure, so are more likely to suffer the impacts of heat waves together with urban heat islands, are more likely to live in areas of transportation corridors, particularly affected by the pollution from heavy vehicles, right? And are those same populations are the ones that are not receiving. I mean, working with them, we were telling them, okay, guys, what can we do here? They said, well, don't give us anything, guys. Just allow us to have the means, the opportunities to achieve our goals. And that means they used to say, well-paid, good quality jobs, good investment, stop neglecting us, etc. So it's not because they are lazy. Of course, some of us are more likely to be sensitive to the impacts of heat waves, etc., because we are elderly or working in some activities. But there are structural reasons why inequities in vulnerability, in capacity, in the ability to decide what the problems are and the solutions are, exist. And it is very important for us, and that's why I love to work with physical scientists and engineers, to understand that in order to put our knowledge, our tools, etc., to bear on starting with these communities and see how to catalyze change. And I know I sound very, very naive, but I'm not, because I am convinced that without this collective action and mobilization, which the US has shown in many parts of, right, mobilization against what is happening with the current government. Without that, it will be really hard to do something. It's still hard, right? But I don't know, we need to address these vulnerabilities as social constructs, as things that are created by us, by the way we relate to each other and with the environment.
Excellent. Sarah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Sarah Walker, and I'm an assistant professor in human dimensions of natural resources here in our Warner College at CSU. And I want to start by saying that I'm an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist. So right off the bat, conceptual clarity matters a whole lot when you're thinking about and trying to draw on different disciplines to do your work. And so I think I've spent the last decade struggling or being challenged with how do we bring these different disciplines, particularly in my case across the social sciences, in ways that they can speak to each other and build off one another. And if we're not clear about what we mean conceptually, it's not just cognitively painful. It is hard to be able to translate the findings and the work of one scholar to another, and then even harder to translate it to a local context. And so if we really want science to do its job, where we're supposed to be building upon each other's work and then having some sort of real world impact, if we're not clear about what we mean, and I'm not arguing that we should all have the same definition, but we better be clear about what we mean in order to be able to collaborate and actually have real world impact. So that's always sort of been the perspective at which I come to this discussion from. When I think about my work, I work both abroad and here in the US. A lot of my work has been in East Africa and Northern Kenya over the last decade or so. And a concept, in addition to vulnerability, that sort of defines most of my work is human well-being. And let's frame that as a question of what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to flourish, as Ken was talking about earlier? And I think when you contrast vulnerability and well-being, you get these really interesting critiques of vulnerability. And the place that is showing up for me right now that I just can't stop thinking about is some work we've been doing around adaptation and gender equity and drought. And so the best example I can use is if you listen to the current narrative around how climate in many places globally is impacting women, they will tell you that it is putting more work, more labor, more time, security issues, right? That's the narrative, which I don't argue against that narrative. However, I think it's more nuanced and complicated than that. And so in the case of working with Samburu women, sort of pastoralists in northern Kenya, you also start to learn that one of the key adaptation strategies there to think about or reducing vulnerability to drought is changing herd composition. So moving from cattle mostly to sheep and goats, which has all sorts of ecological impacts that are both positive and negative in many cases. But from a social gender role, gender equity standpoint, women are actually having increasing responsibility over herds because herding sheep and goats is traditionally the work of women. And so if you take a household's herd, which is essentially equivalent to how we would think about our savings or our bank account, and now you put more decision-making power around livestock into the roles of women, there's also these implications around agency and decision-making power at the financial scale. And so the conversations I've been having with pastoralists and herders around this context is this unintended, and many of the women I work with would argue a positive impact, which many people, if you thought about it from a vulnerability standpoint, would think about it as negative, right? If we're thinking about it in that value statement. And so this importance of thinking about other concepts that contradict or critique the difference between a deficit or an asset-based framing, which I think a lot of us have been talking about. The other thing in my work that I'm thinking about around vulnerability, we spend a lot of time talking about vulnerability to hazards or climate impacts. And we don't spend enough time talking about vulnerability to the unintended and sometimes intended consequences of adaptation. And so one place that's showing up is in work that Karen and I we're doing together around social equity and well-being impacts of flood buyouts in northern New York State, and looking at communities that are resorting to buyouts, so governments purchasing homes and land in places where the value of the land can't even meet insurance payments, right? Flood insurance payments, or the damage that's being caused by flooding. And so if you looked at vulnerability as like a social vulnerability index, you might not always see these rural communities as highly vulnerable in the traditional ways that we measure vulnerable, but they're incredibly vulnerable to the consequences of the adaptation strategy, which is turning small rural towns essentially into ghost towns in some places. And that is largely because of power dynamics between New York City and the state of New York and upstate New York, where they have very little control over land. Because right now, this is a crazy statistic, but in some counties in upstate New York City actually owns up to 75% of the land in a county. And there's really big, interesting dynamics around water quality and owning land to try to protect water quality, which we talk about as like the conservation gold star, is having massive implications on essentially handcuffing rural communities of their ability to adapt to flooding. And what you result in is communities having to take buyouts. So those are some of the things in my work right now that are showing up as critiques of vulnerability, but not saying it's a concept we should throw out the window, but that we should think about it in nuanced ways and be clear about what we mean when we say it.
Great. And Karen, thanks I'm glad you made it. We introduced you before, but go ahead and introduce yourself again.
Thanks so much. And I want to apologize for being late. I was teaching down at CU Boulder and didn't want to leave my class too early, but they're working on a group project, so it was fine. So I'm Karen. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Studies at CU Boulder. And I do a lot of work at the intersection of environmental change, human health and well-being, and conservation. So I initially kind of came to this space thinking about vulnerability of non-human actors and non-human entities, and thinking about wildlife as uniquely vulnerable and sort of lacking agency, as Sarah was just talking about, to respond to an ecosystem change, environmental change, climatic change that they're obviously not contributing to. And so a lot of my work is thinking about the interface of trying to support human health and well-being in conservation landscapes where that's a priority, and the inherent trade-offs, again, sort of echoing some of the points made by others, right, that are not the trade-offs that are a result of systems that are operating well beyond the scale and scope of the community that's sharing a landscape with monkeys that are eating their crops every day, right? And so thinking about how people are made to be vulnerable because of agency and the lack of agency that is, as a result of basically systems of oppression that operate at global scales. So think a lot about people, and one example that comes to mind in the context of sort of human wildlife conflict and coexistence in a changing climate and vulnerability is some work that we're doing in Thailand with communities living outside Quebri National Park that has a really wonderful conservation success story in that they've seen their elephant populations increase significantly over the past several decades, which is really exciting and wonderful for elephants and elephant conservation globally. At the same time, the climate is changing, it's getting drier, there's much less food and water available for elephants on the landscape, and so they leave and in search of those things. And in the surrounding landscape, again, thinking about sort of the globalized capitalistic world that we live in, there's a bunch of pineapple field. This is where if you've ever opened up a can of Dole, it's probably come from, at least some of those pineapple might have come from this region. So the elephants leave, they eat the pineapple. That is a source of livelihood because it's a stable economic market and there's global demand for it. And that has obviously negative consequences. And this is an area where humans have been killed, elephants have been killed, and it's a real sort of conflict hotspot. And so we have been working with folks there to try to understand, okay, is there an alternative livelihood approach? Are there other crops that we might be able to grow to support coexistence and basically sharing a landscape with these elephants that are really responding to global climatic change? And what we're finding is, obviously, as you might guess, it's not that simple. And the reality is that when we, and I'm specifically thinking about sort of conservation efforts that try to adjust what people are doing in the face of conflict with wildlife, we don't often consider the breadth of social, economic, cultural realities that might inhibit someone's ability to switch from growing pineapple to growing something like lemongrass, garlic, or galangal that might be culturally relevant and are indeed things that elephants choose not to eat. And so in theory, this is a good idea, but when you look at it in practice, there's a lot of variability in terms of, do you have access to the appropriate markets? Can you collectively act in order to increase access to those markets? And conservation entities often aren't equipped to effectively respond to this, but are being asked to respond to essentially an economic challenge that is the result of a changing climate and our desire to improve conservation outcomes. So that's just a specific example that comes to mind when I think about the complexities of vulnerability, both for humans and non-human entities on the landscape, and the ways that our solutions could potentially, as Sarah was talking about as well, exacerbate challenges associated with changing climates. I also have been sort of bringing things closer to home, thinking about vulnerability as potentially the flip side of this concept of sense of place. And sense of place refers to our social and emotional attachments to any locality. And there are generally three components of it. Place dependence, that's our ability to sort of rely on a place to enable our livelihoods, our economic activities, and the kind of people that we want to be. Place attachment, that's the extent to which we feel attached to a place, the extent to which we love a place. We appreciate the beauty of the mountains, the landscape, etc. And then place identity, which is possibly my favorite component or dimension of sense of place, because it's really an individual's ability to kind of see their full selves and self-actualize in reference to or in that place, right? All of the things around us that allow us to feel joy, that allow us to connect with our community, that allow us to grow and be the kind of people that we want to be and lead the good life that we want to lead. And so when I'm thinking about vulnerability, I'm thinking about the ways in which a variety of environmental hazards and climate change disrupt those dimensions of sense of place, right? It limits our ability to depend on a place for our economic well-being. It limits our ability to connect with others in the outdoors, for example, in the ways that we might have, prior to a flood or a fire or a landslide. And so I'm also thinking about how different dimensions of sense of place might influence our vulnerability. So for instance, if you have a certain livelihood that ties you to that location and you don't feel you have other livelihood opportunities in other locations, right, that influences your vulnerability, right, your capacity to change your livelihood activities, to adapt, to move, to go to other places. And so it's new, and we're doing some work around the Colorado River in reservoir-dependent communities where water is really critical not only to sense of place, but also to livelihood activities in a variety of ways, and thinking about how changing sense of place is linked to vulnerability and could potentially identify leverage points for collective action to adapt to increasingly arid Western US. So a little bit about me.
Great, thank you. Before I open it up to the community for questions, I have a couple of questions that I'm going to phrase for the panel to handle. Not directed to anyone in particular, so feel free to build off of this and build off of each other. Listening to you, we've just heard a lot of different viewpoints on vulnerability. A lot of concepts of urban versus rural, developed nation versus developing nation. So there's a lot of complexity and a lot of systems way of thinking about this. So why does vulnerability look different in different communities? And what is the local context reveal that when we talk about climate change at kind of the broadest scales, which is often the way it's phrased, misses? So where do we learn, what do we gain from thinking about this at that local scale, and why are local scale issues so different?
Also by hearing everyone, this is amazing what you guys have been talking about. I want to bring the case of Mexico City. I have been working since I was a student with a community of farmers in Mexico City. They grow the chinampas. I don't know whether you know about those. They are called, Humboldt called them the floating gardens. They don't float, by the way, but this is a very, very sustainable system. But what I want to share a couple of things with you, building on what you have said. First of all, although these communities were negatively affected by a process of extraction of water extraction, that's and dispossession and hydrocolonialism that started at the dawn of the last century, they have been able to navigate the challenges of being like a sacrifice zone, right? And continue to produce these chinampas and have a sense of place, a culture, religious activities associated with that. Meaning, they don't feel vulnerable. Do you know what I mean? They feel proud of who they are, but still you see how they have been dispossessed and how they suffer from urbanization, urban growth, encroachment, water extraction, the fact that the government provided them with non-sufficiently treated waters that are contaminated that area, and still they continue to produce there. And you know, so I just find the whole thing quite complex, you know, like you cannot say they are vulnerable. We know they are, but they don't feel they are, right? And they have a strong attachment to the soil, to the tierra, as they call it. And one point more, bringing to your question, climate change doesn't matter to them, although climate change is affecting and aggravating their problems. It's like, you know, an adding process, but they don't see it that way. That's why I don't know in your work, I usually don't start necessarily with climate change as a key concern, but I start with the concerns, the aspirations, the dreams, the fears that they deal with every day. And of course, climate change appears there. So that's something I would like to bring to the group too.
So there's so much to talk about. There's so much overlap. Look, some of the work that we've done recently, I don't know if folks have heard about what's been happening in Australia in terms of climate disasters, but you know, the worst fires ever, 2019, 2020. In some areas, I mean, flooding that you know they've never seen before. One of the communities, you know, they built a new bridge over the river because you know we knew the river was going to come, and seriously within 6 months, the bridge had been topped by a flood. In the northern rivers, which is sort of the border of New South Wales and Queensland, where we have a clinical center for rural health, they had a 1,000-year flood. 1,000-year flood. And 2 weeks later, just as they were cleaning up, they had a 100-year flood. In all of these cases, the state is useless, right? Emergency services can't get there. The entire system set up to respond to disasters like that, fires and floods, can't do it. And so communities step up. And so we followed up with some pretty in-depth research with 3 communities hit by unprecedented but fully expected disasters. And we really were just curious about how they responded, where they learned what they needed to learn, and what worked for them. And really, so we did this in 3 different communities, and really the 2 things that came out of this research is 1, local knowledge, including local knowledge of place. Right? People know how the fires are going to act, people know how the rivers are going to rise. They knew that flood was coming way before the emergency management system did. Right? It's just that knowledge of place, that identity, not just in place, but with the river, knowing that kind of, having that kind of relationship. So that kind of local knowledge, as well as local knowledge of who lives where, right? Who can't get out of their house, you know, how to get into someone's house if they're, you know, trapped in their attic because the water was up past the 2nd floor. So all of this knowledge being put into place. So local knowledge was key. But the broader idea that came out of this is something that lots of folks call social infrastructure. And it's just, when we talk about social infrastructure, a lot of academics focus on the infrastructure part. It's the concrete part, right? It's what helps people during disasters. It's, you know, having a cafe or having a community center, or it's all the infrastructure part. But you talk to communities, the important part is the social part of social infrastructure. It's the knowledge exchange. It's the existing resilience organizations, which are dotted across the place. It's the Aboriginal communities who understand what's happening and have lived through all kinds of these issues before. Australia is the only place where we have a living culture that existed before the Holocene, right? There's actually lots of memory about radical environmental change. So social infrastructure is these kinds, it's the relationships, it's that kind of knowledge. And these are the 2 things, the sort of local knowledge and social infrastructure, the social side of social infrastructure, that people say protects them from the kind of vulnerabilities that have been constructed for them. And so we're quite interested in working with, and we've been arguing with the state and pushing for more attention to the sort of local knowledge and social infrastructure. But what we have in a lot of places is maladaptation, right? So what the state has done, instead of focusing on social infrastructure, is limited home buyouts, right? The most vulnerable homes get bought out. It tears communities up. People have to choose between their community or further vulnerability, right? And this very individualized approach to buying out the most at-risk house doesn't take into account the importance of local knowledge and that kind of social infrastructure that exists. So absolute cases of these kinds of maladaptation. So lots to talk about, lots of bad examples, but one of the things that I really like about these cases is just the amount of energy and the amount of focus on well-being and what works, and a real focus on, and this is what gets government interested, on social infrastructure being effective and quite efficient, right? It's a lot cheaper to fund a community network than it is to build a new library.
One of the things that I'm sort of thinking about and reacting to all of you is when thinking about a work of my colleague has been doing around triangulating NDVI data, so remote sensing data around vegetation indices, with constructed drought timelines of pastoral communities across sub-Saharan Africa. And I want to be clear, the intention here is not to compare community and traditional knowledge of when droughts occurred with like Western science ideas of when droughts occurred. Our assumption is that droughts are social and ecologically constructed. And so how do we understand when one type of data tells us maybe there should have been what is considered a drought, and particularly when government and aid agencies pay attention to that type of data? What does communities' historical timelines of drought tell us about how that drought was experienced? And so one of the things that's really interesting in some of the preliminary analysis he's been doing is that every time and these are interviews with elder communities or elders in communities, when they articulate that they experienced a drought, you can see that on the NDVI data over the last 30 or so years. But there are many instances in when the NDVI data suggests there was a significant vegetation change where it doesn't come out on the community timelines. And so what we think this points to is places where, and times in where communities were particularly resilient to these changes in what we would consider an ecological drought. And then when you start to get into, well, what was happening at that time and place, we think a lot about difference in vulnerability across places, but we don't often think about it across time. And from what we're starting to explore and talking to local communities and government stakeholders is that it was rarely the same thing that they're hypothesizing is what made a community resilient. It might have been disease spread or a pandemic or epidemic at a particular time. It might have been tribal conflict that was occurring in an area. It might have been conflict with a government at that colonial government at that time. And so the thing that I just keep taking away from is we spend so much time, to David's point, trying to articulate like what is it and what are these drivers and what are these indicators, and these case studies in these same communities, well, the answer is never the same. And so thinking about local vulnerability and local adaptation across communities, but also across space and time, I think is a really important consideration.
Great. If no one else wants to chime in on that, I think we're going along on time. I'd like to open it up for the community to be able to ask questions. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask the whole panel or a particular panelist your question.
Thank you. My name is Jerry. I think that we can't solve our environmental vulnerabilities until the majority of the people in that area have experienced that vulnerability. Here in Colorado, along the Front Range, we've had a problem with ozone. As long as I can remember, it's past where, let's say, it's safe, and yet we don't do enough. People have to be hurt by that ozone, I think, before we're finally going to get something done about it. That's what we do in a democracy. Enough people have to vote for it, so to speak.
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's a lot in your comments, and I think there is very much something to be said for, real experiences driving action, right? We know that lived experiences influence how you respond to the same or even other hazards in the future, and also your willingness to collaborate. I guess that feels pessimistic in a way that I'm not ready to fully lean into, that we all have to experience it directly, right? Because then that limits our capacity to think globally, it limits our capacity to sort of empathize with the experiences with others, or it sort of presumes a limited capacity to empathize with the experiences of others. And I guess I would advocate for, and I draw here from a phrase that I first heard from Ed Young, the science writer, originally came from Liz Neely, who's an incredible science communicator. You can't replace a feeling with a fact. And the recognition that shared, compelling stories about what's happening in Mexico City, in Thailand, and wherever we're thinking about, in ways that resonate with human experiences across the world, can help us start to understand and take action to support others. It's not necessarily going to address all of our challenges, but I think these stories can be really effective for seeing human connection and motivating action.
Something I would add to that, in addition to the storytelling and the ability to empathize, I also think this is where the concept of agency comes back in, right? There's one thing to understand and to feel the impacts of climate change or a particular environmental hazard. It's another thing to feel like you have control or that your actions have a meaningful outcome on the scenario or the situation. And so I think that's the other part of the puzzle. If we're not thinking about creating spaces and ways for people to feel like they have more agency, whether that's real or perceived, that's a really important piece of collective action. And so I think if we're ignoring that, it doesn't matter how many of us are feeling climate change impacts or not. If we're not working on avenues for people to feel like they can engage as decision makers and feel heard, then I think the widespreadness of climate impacts isn't going to matter a whole lot.
Hi, my name is Colin Rice. I'm a philosopher of biology here at CSU. and this actually builds off of what Sarah just said. I wanted, several of you mentioned sort of connections between systems of oppression and vulnerability. I really wanted to just ask about the connections between voice, or who gets heard in some of these spaces, and vulnerability. When I think about, the value of being vulnerable with my students, it's often about like saying something that's vulnerable, but of course we often mean vulnerability in a sense of like, some people are so vulnerable that they don't have the privilege to speak, and of course there are lots of animals that don't have that space and other things that we care about. So I guess I'm just curious about the connections between who's vulnerable and who gets to voice that vulnerability, and thinking in particular like parallels with things like vaccine hesitancy, right? There's a lot of questions about the intersections between privilege and voice and how we respond to those things that obviously matter in some of these spaces. So I just wanted to ask about voice and systems of oppression and vulnerability.
And also when I was listening to you, something we are doing in this program I'm working on is to start by asking communities, particularly underserved communities, and also the youth, which is a demographic that sometimes we forget. We ask them 4 questions. How do you see your family, your community in the near future? And that immediately starts them, before we ask them the second question, the barriers, right? Wow, I would like to, so some people some students not so much, but community members, well, you know what, I would like in Xochimilco that we come back to be together, help each other, etc. And then we close with, and what could you do? What can the university do? What can the local authority do? With whom you connect, just to surface the assets, the momentum. And believe me, whenever we finish these sessions, we call them listening sessions because communities don't want us to call them focus groups. They find that we are like focusing on them. Like, what, are you observing me? And you know what they have told us, coming to your point, they have said, it's so good for me to have a voice, that you are paying attention to what I'm saying, that you listen to my solutions, etc., and that we are exploring how to catalyze change. And I was thinking, by listening to you, just being in this conversation is creating a space for collective thinking, learning from each other. And I think we need to catalyze more and more of these actions and surface more and more of these momentums with all the limitations and challenges that exist, because that's what makes us those animales politicos, political animals, right? That Aristoteles, why I'm not pronouncing in English, sorry, my husband always tells me that, always talk about, right? We are political by nature, and we need to bring that, to work on that agency, and we need to create those spaces for people to talk and not be told to.
So, that's wild.
Welcome to Fort Collins.
So on the voice, let me just give an example of community voice and where it's worked. So I mentioned the sort of transport injustice and all of these bus stops across Western Sydney that have no shade, no shelter, rain or heat. It's above 40 degrees out there, whatever, 120. And this has been an issue for years. An NGO started up about 5 years ago, phenomenal organization called Sweltering Cities, and they're working with communities who are made vulnerable to heat waves. And remember, heat waves, only poor people die in heat waves, right? So it's not just the experience, right? Because resilience is a privilege, and in Sydney, when it gets 40 degrees, rich people turn on air conditioning, right? So there's lots of people that don't have that. But when it comes to the transport stuff, so I'll go back to the transport stuff. So Sweltering City started this project where they had people take pictures of their local bus stop, and they actually gave out temperature gauges to have people take the temperature on the ground, right? 56 degrees, I don't even know what that is, 140, 130, 140, right? On the ground where people are waiting for their buses. They blasted this to all, to the state government, the transport minister. This has been going on for 5 years. And finally, really, 2 months ago, the state government is investing something like $20 million into new bus shelters in Western Sydney. Right? So it was this opportunity to give voice, to talk about the construction of vulnerability. The other thing they did was compare Eastern Sydney, which is a bit richer, with Western Sydney, which is not, and all these nice bus stops and shaded streets and all of that, compared to Western Sydney, which has none of it. So they brought those pictures, they brought that experience to the state government, and thankfully there's been some investment. We'll see what happens with it. But it is an NGO working with communities to bring that experience, bring the voice, bring the photographs, and the temperature to decision makers.
I guess I have another case that might help, and hopefully it'll tie together a couple of these things, an example of how voice works. So I was in this community group up in Innovate. This is a collection of First Nations populations dealing with the caribou, Canadian government. There's supposed to be a US government representative there, but it was February, so there wasn't. And just leave it at that. And I think what was interesting is when they were talking about the data collection, and one of the real challenges is to figure out in that context how many caribou are being taken, because there's no tagging from First Nations populations, and even if there were, I mean, there are 40,000 people living in Yukon, which is the size of Montana, so it's kind of challenging for data collection generally. And so we're sitting in this meeting, and one of the representatives from one of the, I think there were 8 or 9 First Nations groups there, asked whether or not their data had been acknowledged in the response. And I was like, yeah, this is a community group problem if people don't think that their data has been integrated. And the response he was given wasn't just that it was included, but there was a very particular reference to the kinds of responses they got, a qualitative response, not just that the data had been integrated into the following response. And this kind of struck me because it wasn't like the contract, if you've given me a service and therefore I owe you data, was done, but it was really just straightforwardly about whether or not the voice of the population had been recognized in this particular community group. And that strikes me because in response to the other question about democracy, one of the crucial features was it wasn't just that the input was there, but the input was recognized as something that was shared and not reducible to a common overall single metric. Right? And this is the empathy line as well, that we recognize that there are individual points of view that can't be reduced to a common theme. I think there are ways of making this work, and I saw one take place, and it was kind of jaw-dropping at how effective and how obvious it was when it did take place. And how you do end up having this idea to come to a common framework and a common viewpoint, especially in like, this is a time of crisis, this is the populations recognizing that their shared identity shaping place is going extinct. And even in that context, they're recognizing that individual voices are as significant as the crisis they're facing. And that was a beautiful case of how you had this intersection between empathy, voice, and collaborative decision making. So I think there are ways to make it happen, but I think that the special sauce is somehow figuring out how to recognize that we have a shared solution that has to come, but we can't do so while reducing individual viewpoints to a single thing. There has to be a recognized diversity and shared points of view. And I think that's sort of the secret of maintaining voice in these complex collective decision-making processes.
Great, our next question.
I'm Bob Streeter, live in eastern Larimer County. There's so many sides to this picture and perspectives. But you mentioned that we're a democracy, and this is 2026, and it's an election year. We're going to have elections in Colorado. We have a drought going on broadly through the Front Range. I have neighbor farmers that are not going to be planting some of their fields this year because of less than 50% of the irrigation water will be available. So I guess my question is very pragmatic. We're going to have a governor election. We're going to have election for other representatives. What 2 or 3 things can a government do that the representatives should be campaigning on Certainly, community action, individual action, all of that is very important. And I don't downplay that at all. But we do have a government that manages money and manages laws, etc. What are 2 or 3 things that should be high in the discussion period for our election this year? Silence. Come on, bring your academic minds down to the world.
Well, I used to live for 17 years in Boulder, Colorado, and when it comes to water in Colorado, I think that the first thing that needs to be done is to work on the way, this allocation principle, right? The first come, first serve, and start to think on how to restructure the approach to allocating water. You know, that's the first thing. The second is that just now the farmers in Colorado and in many parts of the US are suffering because of the impacts of the war in Iran, right? So another key intervention point is to support those farmers, because the support to those farmers is a support that helps the rest of the communities who need some subsidies, some supports to them. So, and the third thing I would ask a decision maker to do is to better prepare to deal with the heat waves and extreme heat waves, and also the floods that Colorado might suffer. Because I know from when we were in 2013 suffering, remember that super extreme flood, 1 in a 500 in some areas, that cut, right? I did field work with many in Boulder who are super organized as leaders in many areas affected by the floods. But something I learned is that we are not ready to deal with the cascading effects that these events bring. So we need to learn to prepare to that, and always learn from prior lessons as to how the connected pieces work. And just to give you an example, of the 7 roads connecting the mountains with we are talking about Boulder, Longmont, etc. Only 1 was working, and that really prevented many communities to recover. So I think that we need to learn to deal with these complexities and learn to fail, and we are not ready for that. So those are the 3 things that I would like that you help us tell leaders, or that we mobilize here in Colorado to address. Does that sound like good, doable things? I know the first one is harder, but the other 2 are not so.
I think 2 things come to mind. The first is around this false dichotomy between centralized and decentralized government. And I think we know local adaptation planning matters a whole lot. The problem is when we put all of our eggs in the local adaptation planning, we put all of the burden, particularly on small, under-resourced communities who may not have the technical expertise or the capacity to do the level of planning that needs to happen. But if you flip it the other way and say we're going to centralize all of that planning at the state level, that's also not going to work, because we miss this local context that we've all been spending the last 30 minutes talking about why it's so important. And so how do we make sure, if I was asking questions to my elected leader, I would say, what are you doing to try to get the resources and the support to communities and then get out of the way, right? Those are the pieces that I think about. The other thing coming from a project I was a part of recently that was looking at this concept of capacity. We often think about adaptation capacity as a sum of assets, right? What are the things that you can pull together to then do something in terms of your adaptation to a climate hazard? What we spend a lot of time not thinking about is the process of transitioning assets into action. And so in the case of Colorado and wildfire in particularly, we know there are cases of communities that would be considered particularly high asset level communities, even if you're just thinking about it from a financial standpoint, who have a hard time translating that into actual adaptation outcomes. And then we have communities who we would consider, or some might consider as like lower asset or having lower resources, who are actually doing a phenomenal job of transitioning or translating their limited resources into adaptation outcomes. And so the question there is process, right? What is happening going from asset to outcome and thinking about adaptation outcomes? And so the thing I would then ask an elected representative to think critically about is how do we make the bottlenecks of being able to translate resources into adaptation outcomes? How do we understand what those bottlenecks are and how do we remove them?
I think several people have talked about how vulnerabilities are constructed. And it's not super comfortable. And I think the question I'd ask is how we could rethink the water structuring system in the state that's been built around us. A presumption of a baseline that's was never real. And I think that we've developed a vulnerability off of that. And looking at the ways we might return to taking the water allocation system as something that should be resilient to changes is the wrong way of structuring vulnerability and adaptation in a changing climate. So I think we just need to be honest about the nature of that particular system and the vulnerabilities and adaptation models that are attached to it. How to proceed from that, I do not know. But I think we really just need to own up to what that system is. It's an artificial system that's creating artificial vulnerabilities as a result.
Yeah, and I guess I would just quickly add, I think very concretely, very tangibly, if we're restructuring sort of artificially built systems, if we're figuring out how to translate assets to action, that leaves people vulnerable while we're figuring those things out. So, bottom line, what are our social safety nets, right? Are you, an elected official, working hard to make sure the farmers who are not able to plant still have what they need to be able to think about what next season's going to look like, be able to translate their assets into action and the social supports that allow them to persist when yields are declining. So I think it's a very basic thing that we maybe talk about more.
Great. Our next question.
Thank y'all so much for y'all's time on this panel. It's been so interesting listening to what y'all are working on. My question, David kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to hear more from y'all about have you found technology broadly construed, super broad, to be an important mitigator or even a detriment in reacting to climate change or climate action?
So I think technology, if you understand that in terms of a broad conception, technically, so the ways in which we go about trying to bring about ends through socially constructed measures, so that's policy and a wide range of other things. Well, yeah, the ways in which we have to resolve changing circumstance and systems and interconnections. I know it's kind of academic head speak, but it really matters. Like ecological systems are changing at one pace and one rate based on climate change and a range of other sort of non-climate change related factors. And governmental systems are based on certain kind of static orientations, like you want predictability in your legal system and you have social systems. So the intersection between those two will lead to conflicts. And so trying to resolve that is basically a technical solution. So if you're thinking of technology in that way, then absolutely, we can't help but do that. Every time we change policy and engage in it, we're engaged in a technological solution to a problem facing us. If you mean mechanical technologies and such, then I think we'll probably similarly do that. We can't figure out how to engage in the kinds of measurements or the aggregation of data without using certain kinds of technological responses as well. So I think we're pervasive. We just have to, I'm an environmental ethicist, so I can quote Leopold once, right? We just have to make sure at some point that we realize that the technologies we use are tools we use and we're not the tools for our technologies.
I want to think of thermal comfort as an example of how we could think of technology. We know that retrofitting is one of the key means. Retrofitting our homes is one of the key means to address thermal comfort. And that means insulating our homes. It also means working on the windows, ensuring that they are sealed, getting heat pumps, and electrifying the way you keep your home at a comfortable level. The problem with those approaches is A, that they are super expensive. Just changing your electric panel in order to have a heat pump can cost you, and I tell you because in Toronto we just did it. It cost us $12,000 to just do that. And it's a lot of money that many people cannot afford. The upfront costs are high. So what many of us are suggesting is that we use principles of sufficiency, meaning perhaps we don't need to do all these things, all these investments. Perhaps there are other approaches that are not so expensive, that are more behavioral, that and that still can keep families in temperature, the homes in temperatures that are really comfortable. We also need to consider that women and men have not the same sense of what is comfortable temperature-wise. You get older, you have a different sense of what is comfortable. So we need to understand that thermal comfort is a cultural construct. So in short, to your question, you need to really adapt these technological interventions to the needs of the groups you are working with. It gets cheaper, you get the buy-in you need, and it's flexible, and you don't waste so many resources. So there are many people who are working on these alternative approaches to technological innovations, and this is just an example of that, which relates from a city perspective, right, David, to vulnerability and resilience, community resilience.
So I guess, I would respond to the two questions in the same way. For me, I don't live here, so I don't know what I would tell you guys, but for us, it would be, subsidize electrification, subsidize retrofits of housing, subsidize air conditioning, and solar. But that's, technology is never going to be enough. The problem with a lot of folks in Sydney is that they have air conditioning, but they can't afford to run it, right? So you'll have people, sitting in sweltering homes with just not, so it's not just about the tech, right? You've got to deal with the inequality and subsidizing people. A number of folks have asked around heat, why we don't declare disasters for heat waves as we do for floods and fires, because then people could get a disaster payment for a heat wave that would subsidize the electricity that they use to run their air conditioning. If they knew that, they could get that money, then they turn on their air conditioners. So you can't, it's never going to be the tech alone.
Let me just add to what you say. What you are saying applies to the US, right? But for instance, in Latin America, we are starting a project in Mexico and in Sao Paulo. Well, we are dealing with issues of really lack of access to the means, the services, right? Such as water, housing, etc. So, and the governments claim that they don't have resources, period, right? So, yeah, I know, you can say it's not true, whatever, but the question is, how do we get this started? And therefore, building on what you say, I would say, yes, we need to work, ensure, mobilize, so that community members are able to use their AC. For instance, in Phoenix, they don't use it, even though they have it, for the same reasons you mentioned. But in Latin America or in Africa, you are talking about really a different reality, and therefore some scholars, like me, are saying, besides that, we need to create capacities in other ways that prevent us from waiting for the government to do something,
Yeah, just there's one other thing happening in Sydney, which is really interesting, which gets at that, and it gets to the tech question. There's a great research center, Heat and Health Research Center at Sydney, and they've been developing this fan-first heat response. And so they're really focusing on the low tech and the low cost, right? It's much cheaper to run a fan. And there's there's a lot of things that they're doing, but they're really trying to educate and give people the information about how to lower the heat in their home and on their body in particular in ways that won't cost them money. So it's not just about the high tech, it's about using the low tech as well.
Yeah, I want to just quickly echo that and highlight a lot of the tech that we rely on, particularly around electrification, demands resources that are often gathered externally with massive detriments to the environment. So thinking about the sort of low-tech tech options that enable us to achieve the climate resilience that we want is really critical, because we can't decide that the Democratic Republic of the Congo is a sacrifice zone because of the cobalt there, right? That's enabling us to create batteries. I mean, I guess we can decide that. We shouldn't decide that, I would argue, and hopefully not be argued against. But yeah, just thinking about how can we return to indigenous knowledge, local understandings of the environment, and rely on technology, right, in the broadest sense, to achieve our goals.
Hey, I've been told we have a cutoff time in just a couple of minutes, so I'm going to go one last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Hello. I've been hearing a lot of themes throughout this around collective action, community response, local mobilization, and for me, all those things can only occur if there's a shared reality. People are living in a shared reality, so they can group together, work together, right? Which reminds me, of course, of the current moment. Once again, people have referenced it already, 2026, United States, democratic erosion, all that sort of things. And I have found myself very poor at communicating about vulnerabilities that we're all currently in right now to other people for mobilization. Like personally, I've been trying, and I'm not that great at it. So I'm just curious, how do you all talk to people about their vulnerabilities when they're not quote unquote aware of it? And I know that's simplifying the whole thing, and I'm talking especially about in your community. I'm not saying going into a different community, a different country, and saying, hey, you're vulnerable, and they're like, what are you talking about? I mean, if you're in your community, how do you have that conversation with someone to help them understand the vulnerable position they are in?
I'm going to start because it's super short. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. I'm not trying to change people's minds. I'm trying to understand what matters to them.
I was gonna say the same thing and pull on an example that is not academic at all. But I grew up in a family that has very different political, social, all sorts of values. And I think about, despite my dad and I having a lot of differences, we still have these hard conversations. I grew up in an ag family. My family are still farmers. Who are not going to talk a lot about climate change willingly unless I'm pushing that conversation, yet having conversations about vulnerabilities, and that's never the word I would ever use with my father because he would be so insulted, and he would also be fine with me telling you this, I should say this. The concept of vulnerability would be, he would consider that an insult, right? It ignores all of the work and the number of times local rural ag or farming communities and families have been resilient to challenges long before we were starting to talk about climate change. And so the conversations that we have been having that have been, I feel like, somewhat productive, have been a lot about me asking for stories about times when families and grandparents and great-grandparents have dealt with challenges not similar but important and big challenges in the environment or in social systems. And so I feel like that asking questions and asking for stories feels like an initial way to start building common ground, right? Shared interests. We might not need to use the same terminology, but if we have a shared story and a shared understanding and that leads to shared empathy, I feel like that's the first thing I think about.
Hey, it's about out of time. I'd like to thank everyone for attending tonight. This is our last one of the season. We'll start up again in September. And I'd like us to thank the panelists for giving us a great conversation.